Coming up on Chopper's Political Podcast. I think I find it hardest when it's to do with my children. Everything else I can take.
I'm sorry for making you cry. Welcome back to Chopper's Political Podcast, recorded at my favourite pub, a stone's throw from the gates of the House of Parliament. Weekly, I bring you guests, gossip and the best stories from my pub table here in the heart of Westminster. This week, our guest has been setting the world in Westminster alight with a new memoir titled 10 Years to Save the West, which reflects on her short time in Downing Street and on a far longer period as a minister in the Tory government and her worries for the future, but more of them later. Liz Truss, welcome to Chopper's Political Podcast.
Great to be here, Chris.
Great to have you. Here's the book you've got out this week, 10 Years to Save the West. You write in here, it's a great book and a great, it goes backwards, forwards, everywhere. But let's start with your time as Prime Minister briefly. You write you had a plan for the first 100 days in office, but you didn't get past 50. Do you blame yourself at all for that?
Well, of course I'm not in any way saying I'm perfect, but nobody is. I think the circumstances I faced were very difficult. And just looking back over the past, few years, what I feel like is I was in pretty much an impossible situation. I was somebody who had a bold agenda. I felt the country needed change. I felt that people had voted for change. They voted for change in 2016. They'd voted for it again in 2019. And I was determined to deliver that. And what I faced was just massive hostility to that agenda. Throughout
your time, even looking back at the early points on ratios, on childcare.
I mean, you might say, Chris, after having all those experiences with the judiciary, with the childcare people, with the environmentalists, I should have known better. But I had this view that if I could get the top job, then I would be more able to change it. But what I discovered in Downing Street was those forces of resistance were very strong. And to be honest, I didn't have enough support from the Conservative Parliamentary Party to be able to overcome those forces. So, did I get everything right? Obviously not. I'm a human being. I've got strengths and weaknesses like everybody else. But was it actually possible to deliver a Conservative agenda with our current institutional structures and with the current makeup of the Conservative Parliamentary Party? I think the answer is no, it wasn't.
And you make it very clear in the book, if a short passage there, you say that you're not going to manage consensus. Your job is to lead, and that means challenging that consensus. And that's what you did and have tried to do in all your time, despite ingrained hostility of others.
Exactly. Well, I think we've got a big problem in Britain with the status quo. We know it's not working. We've had several decades now of relatively low economic growth. The state is getting bigger. It's now 45% of GDP. Taxes are at a 70-year high. We know that public services aren't working as well as they should. We've seen, productivity in the public sector has flatlined for the last few years. So we know that things have to change. But what we face is a huge resistance to that change. And that is what I feel needs to be cracked through, because at my heart, I'm a patriot. I want this country to be successful, and I want to feel proud of Britain. And too often I feel we've got all these skills and capabilities and these great ideas, and yet they're not being allowed to happen. We can't seem to build. Yep. Just in Norfolk recently, a road has been stopped because of a bat.
One bat
by Natural England,
right.
By Natural England, which is yet another quango that makes decisions that politicians have virtually no say over. We're not building enough houses. We're not getting on with things like fracking, which would reduce our energy costs. And that I just find that hugely frustrating, because I know from speaking to constituents, speaking to members of the public, they want to see things get moving. And that is why I've written the book, because a lot of people say, well, the reason things aren't happening is just X minister isn't good enough, or Y minister isn't tough enough, or, the Prime Minister's got the wrong ideas. But actually, quite often, we have been stymied by the system. And if Conservatives really want to deliver the Conservative policies we all believe in, we've got to actually change that system.
Do you think some of your colleagues are quite happy with a ministerial life, like the car? They might get a fancy house in the country. They're happy with their lot and don't want to take on the challenge that you're describing and getting that road built in Norfolk.
I think there's an element of that. And there's an element of MPs in all parties thinking, what job am I going to get after politics? Do I really want to rock the boat and not be able to get that job on a corporate board? Or do I want to turn up at a dinner party this weekend and be slagged off for being nasty or not being pro the environment or not being pro trans rights? So there's a sort of social conditioning element of this as well, which is if you do try and change things, if you do go against the system, there is a price to pay.
It's a hard road travel.
Yeah, it's a lonely and hard road, and you're not necessarily going to be popular, and you're not necessarily going to have those corporate opportunities. So you can absolutely see why people say, I'd rather take the easy and comfortable path.
But as Prime Minister, you're primus inter pares, first amongst equals. That means you've got to bring your crowd, your audience with you. I guess the cabinet was with you when you pushed forward with that radical growth agenda, but you didn't. The country wasn't with you, and in fact, the markets disowned it and made it very difficult for you.
I think the party was with me. The Conservative Party was with me, and that those are ultimately the decision makers in the leadership election. I was very clear about what I wanted to do. I wanted to get on with fracking. I wanted to get the EU laws off the statute books. I wanted to cut taxes, hold down public spending. I was clear about that during the leadership election, and I got a mandate. And I do feel that mandate was not respected by elements of the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And we had a choice at the time in 22. Did we go for the status quo, more of the same, more of the, and is what I described as the Treasury orthodoxy, because I'm afraid the reality is that a lot of economic policy is actually run by Treasury mandarins. It's run by the Office of Budget Responsibility, and it's run by the Bank of England. It's not necessarily run by politicians. Do we carry on with that Treasury orthodoxy, which is basically big government, high taxes, high immigration, close alignment with the EU, even though we've left the EU?
Yes.
Not really trying to do anything bold or radical. Or do we do something different? And the party members were very clear that they wanted something different. And that is what we promised back in 2019. And I felt that we hadn't delivered it. So if you say, did I bring people with me? I mean, there were people who didn't agree with me. And, I felt those people should have given me more of a chance, frankly. I think there should have been a period where they said, yes, she's got a mandate, let's give her a chance, rather than coming out straight away against the policies I set out. That certainly wasn't helpful.
You blame maybe some MPs saying you need to have an OBR check on your plans.
Well, I didn't hear those same MPs saying there needed to be an OBR check on all the furlough schemes when they were announced. So I think there were double standards going on of trying to be tougher on me than they'd necessarily been previously. And, there are different views in the Conservative Party. I don't think that's a secret. There are some people who believe in the current economic setup that we've got. They believe that the OBR was a good thing. I think it was a bad thing. I think it's done tremendous damage to our economic policy. They believe that the Bank of England should be unchallenged and unquestioned. They're entitled to those beliefs, but I had a mandate from Conservative Party members to deliver, and it's difficult to deliver a mandate if elements of your own party are immediately speaking out against it. So I think that was a problem. But the second problem, Chris, is that over the years, too much power has been handed to so-called independent bodies.
Quangos,
but also the civil service itself. And this, it started in the 90s, got a lot worse under Tony Blair. So the Bank of England was given huge power over monetary policy, which has an effect on everybody across this country.
Like Gordon Brown in
by Gordon Brown, and I don't think they're sufficiently accountable for that. And then we added to that by giving the Office of Budget Responsibility huge power over financial and economic forecasting. And when I tried to take on those organisations, and maybe it was foolish of me to actually say in the leadership election, we've got a problem with this economic establishment who are essentially dictating policy. Maybe that didn't endear me to them.
And they were ready for their revenge.
I think that's true. And maybe that was bad tactics on my part. Fair enough.
Well, you be honest.
I was trying to be honest because I feel that if you do want to make bold change, which the country needed, you have to be upfront about what you're trying to do. And I thought, I didn't realise how ruthless they would be in opposing that agenda. I didn't, even though I'd seen how powerful they were when I was a Treasury Minister, I'd seen other Prime Ministers and Chancellors shy away from taking them on.
Now you see why.
Now I see why. Maybe you could say, well, I should have got the message, I should have taken the hint. But then I thought, well, what's the alternative? Because
managed decline is what you would say.
And so this is why you come back to this point of, was it an impossible task? And actually, in order to implement this type of agenda, do you need a much longer lead-in where you're building support for the agenda?
Preparing the ground.
Do you need an electoral mandate to actually change these
Possibly.
things directly? So go into an election saying, we're going to abolish the ABR, we're going to keep the Bank of England operating monetary policy, but make sure there's much more democratic accountability.
Make it
of monetary policy.
Elected or no? So by the MPs. And...
I think it's right that the Chancellor no longer sets interest rates. It was ludicrous back in the 80s and 90s when there was clearly
electoral planning.
There appeared to be, yes. I think, under both Labour and Conservatives, electoral planning. So I don't think we should go back to the Chancellor actually fiddling with interest rates. But I think the overall scope and approach of monetary policy should be much more accountable to the Chancellor than it currently is. Because what we've had is the monetary policy, tail wagging the economic policy dog. And I think that's a problem, a problem in Britain. So, it might be the case that in order to make those major changes, a longer run-up is needed. But, when I'm thinking to myself about this, I think, was I right to try or not? And I wouldn't have wanted the job of being Prime Minister.
No, and
if I couldn't do anything. If I couldn't do anything, what would have been the point?
And at that point, you had maybe 2.5 years, 3 years left, 2 years left until the election. But people blame you, don't they, for the soaring cost of mortgage? I mean, that's a narrative.
When you say people, the BBC blame me. Political correspondents who don't understand economics blame me.
It's a Labour narrative too.
The Labour Party,
of course
they will, wouldn't they?
Of course they would, yeah.
But it's not the truth. And the fact is, interest rates have gone up in the world, across the world. Mortgage costs have gone up across the world. Rates were artificially too low for too long. And it was inevitable that mortgage costs were going to go up. That is the reality of the situation. And anybody who understands economics understands that. And people are either being disingenuous or, frankly, just not understanding the economic situation. And even people like Robin Peston, who is not...
The ITV presenter.
He is not a Liz Truss, fan club member. But he will say that the Bank of England... he does say the Bank of England should have been investigated for what happened after the mini-budget. Because there were two things that happened. First of all, the Bank of England didn't put interest rates up as much as expected and announced the sale of £40 billion of government debt the night before the mini-budget. And secondly, they failed to alert me or the Chancellor to the fact there was a tinderbox in the financial market
with this
LDI crisis. So, the policies that we put forward, which have been heavily flagged in advance, keeping corporation tax low, making Britain more competitive, getting on with fracking, keeping down public spending.
That was in leadership hustings, you flagged all those.
I flagged all those policies. And again, on the steps of number 10, I was pretty clear about all of those policies, if they'd remained in place, I believe Britain would be in a better position now. I believe economic growth would be higher. The raised taxes have not brought in the revenue.
So was it a timing issue? If the markets are about to respond to that, should you have held back and then done it when that moment had gone from the markets?
If I'd known that there was a tinderbox of these LDIs, which Britain was uniquely exposed to
in our pensions market,
because of poor oversight and regulation by the Bank of England and the Pensions Authority, that is why we had this problem. If I'd known about that, of course, what I or Kwasi would have said is, Bank of England, you need to sort this out before we get on with our fiscal policy. But we did not know about that. And this is what has happened here is the Bank of England have successfully pushed the blame onto me and the Chancellor when we didn't even know about the fundamental cause of the problem. And I think there is a problem with the way the media reported it. And frankly, people didn't understand what was going on were blaming the mini-budget. And it was very convenient for the Bank of England and the economic establishment to say the problem's over here, rather than acknowledging their own role.
And that official in Treasury was let go, wasn't he, by Kwasi Kwarteng early on? Was it part of that? That was a hostile act by the government against the Treasury, maybe?
Well, I believe, and this goes back to the changes I think we need to make in the long term, I believe that as Prime Minister and Chancellor, you need to be able to appoint the people you trust to do the jobs.
Like in America?
Like in America, like in France, like pretty much everywhere across the world apart from Britain. Can you imagine going in as a chief executive of a company and not being able to choose any of the staff that work for you?
A few advisors around you, don't you? A handful of advisors.
But the advisors are paid much less and don't have a position in the official chain of command. So this is this is one of the problems of British government, is that there is not clear enough accountability. And what we ended up with, and I'm not saying, by the way, that civil servants didn't work very hard. I'm not saying there aren't very good civil servants. There are brilliant people in our civil service, but there's a fundamental problem when the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are unable to change, or even when somebody is changed, that becomes a massive media story.
As it did.
It shouldn't have been a massive media story. This is about the reason we did it is because we had a mandate to deliver those policies.
And you wanted someone.
The Permanent Secretary of the Treasury had presided over the economic orthodoxy for a number of years.
It was a statement,
and
really.
We wanted to change that.
I was struck by yes, I get all that. The personal impact to you must have been quite great. You wrote very movingly, I felt, that most children find out about the fallibilities of their parents over a number of years. We all have them. But yours saw yours exposed in a very short time. That's difficult.
It is difficult.
When your children are reading the papers and seeing Twitter.
Yeah, I tell them not to read the papers and not to look at Twitter. And
it's really hard. And then your daughter, Liberty, phoning you from the school playing field saying, don't resign. I mean, I don't know what I'd do.
It was a bit late by then. It was a bit late. I'd written the resignation speech by then.
You were going, that was the day. Yeah. But it's hard. I mean, and people don't really understand the emotional impact on you and that.
Yeah. I mean, I think I find it hardest when it's to do with my children.
Yeah.
Everything else I can take.
Yeah. I think I'm so the same. I mean, that's probably forgotten by critics. Can you forgive the MPs who brought you down?
That's an interesting question. I mean, what I want to do is I want to win this argument.
I'm sorry for making you cry. I didn't mean to make you. It's just so much. I thought as a dad, I was struck by the remarks about the children. Like, no, I feel like that acutely. But in terms of the people who brought you, you walk around Parliament when Parliament's back. Can you look them in the eye, some of these people?
Absolutely. Of course I can.
Yeah.
I mean, what I feel is I went into that job with a clear mandate. I wanted to do the right thing by the country. I did everything within my power to do that, knowing what I knew about the way government worked. And some of them weren't very supportive of that. And, I don't know what they think now, to be honest. But, we as a party, really have to think about what's happened over the last 14 years and what we now need to offer the electorate at the election. And we have to be honest with the public. I get very frustrated when we sort of claim that something's happened when it hasn't happened. People aren't stupid. People judge politicians and politics on what's actually happening in their everyday life. So, are my bills going up? Can I get a job? What's the state of my local high street? They don't judge it on the basis of government press release. And what I'm saying in my book is I think the biggest thing the biggest problem is we didn't take on the Blair legacy enough. And that that goes right back to the mid-2000s when people in the Conservative Party were saying things like heir to Blair or Blair's the master. What Blair did...
That was George Osborne saying that. He called Blair the master, the number two person to David Cameron. I mean, they tried to really copy. And in fact, you're right, of course, but the Tories have only been in power for about 6 out of the 14 years. If you think about it,
that is true
because of the coalition, and then there's
don't get me on
the deal with the deal with
That's a whole other
DUP.
part of my book. But
so I agree. I mean, if I was to ask you what was the single most conservative thing that's happened in the past 14 years, what's the best thing your government's done for the Tory party?
So Brexit.
But that wasn't your policy,
Brexit.
and it wasn't your personal policy.
No,
you were a
correct.
Remainer, and it wasn't the party policy.
And the other good things we've done. I'm very proud of how we stood up for Ukraine.
Yep.
We were the first European country to send them weapons, and we were very strong.
On vaccines,
we were very strong.
Boris Johnson.
Vaccines, the trade deals. I'm very proud of what we did on trade.
Australia's doing very well now, isn't it? I read.
Exactly.
Which you
people slab it, but
at the time they did.
Exactly. But this is the lesson of policies, that it's the policies that people slam at the time and are difficult to get through that are often the ones that have the most positive impact. And education reform. Yeah. What we did on education, if you look at the education results, the way they're different between Scotland and England. Yeah.
Yeah, and Nick Gibb, of course, and you were there too, and others. You said in an interview with Nigel Farage earlier this week that people say Tories are libertarians who have daughters, and having daughters has made you more conservative. That's fascinating. Do you think mothers are naturally more conservative?
I think there is. So, the reason I went into politics in the first place is I do believe passionately in freedom. I don't like being told what to do. I don't think the government knows best. And those were the instincts that sort of propelled me into politics. And I've always believed in low taxes. I've never believed in central planning. I think these are stupid ideas that fail time and time again. But I think on issues like, I think being a parent, being a mother has made me more concerned about issues like crime. I've become very, worried about the whole pushing of the transgender agenda and the sort of undermining of basic human biology and the undermining of what a family is and all these kind of things,
That's a cause been turned with the cash report.
I've become more concerned about our way of life being challenged. So I think I started off in a very much live and let live. You do what you want, I'll do what I want. And now I think that there is a sort of activist lefty agenda, which is actually pushing the sort of cancellation of that way of life. Actively pushing it, and that is what really worries me. And it's
in government, the media. Where is that?
Well, it starts with the activists. So it starts with the Greta Thunbergs of this world, or the the trans activists. We've seen Stonewall pushing this very, very damaging ideological agenda. And then what happens is people in authority, rather than taking that on, have accepted it or tried to meet those people halfway. So
Michael Gove met Greta Thunberg, didn't he? Was that a mistake?
Yes, it was. And the net zero agenda, the extreme net zero agenda that we've been pursuing in Britain, is a result of pushing by those environmental activists. Of course, we need to protect our clean environment. That is not the same as economically damaging ourselves so that Britain can't compete and so our people are poorer.
But Rishi Sunak gets that, doesn't he? He's rode back on some of those net 2030 plans, hasn't he, for example?
But the underlying targets are still baked into the system. This is the problem. We haven't actually junked the legislation.
Do you want to vote on that?
We didn't get rid of the Climate Change Act that Labour put in. We didn't do anything about the Climate Change Committee, which has become another slightly quangocratised organisation. So we've made some moves, and I support things like getting rid of the ban on oil boilers, but those are relatively, we need to do a lot more.
Just on that, though, the net zero target for 2050 was brought in by Theresa May without a vote in the House of Commons, amending, I think, the Climate Act 2008, I think. Should there be a vote, even in Parliament, on net zero? Should there be a referendum on net zero?
So I think the issue of net zero, it's interesting, isn't it, that the European Court of Human Rights has now started opining on net zero and getting involved in politics. See, none of these issues are disconnected. The issue of human rights and immigration, the issue of net zero, the issue of wokery, this is all part of unelected judges, bureaucrats pursuing an agenda that is not the agenda.
So why not give a vote on net zero then in Parliament?
I think instead what we should be thinking about is all of these things. The Human Rights Act, the Climate Change Act, the Constitutional Reform Act, which created a Supreme Court in Britain. And we need to repeal all of them. Yep. If you just repeal part of it, you get the ECHR telling you've got to do those policies anyway. That's what I'm saying, Chris. It's not enough. It's not enough just to have conservative policies and try and implement them. You've actually got to change the system, because we're now in a position where we're running into judicial activism, technocrat activism. Yep. We need to deal with those things as well.
So you draw a line from the 2016 vote to where you are now, and your conclusions at the end: we must be conservatives in the book, must dismantle leftist state, restore democratic accountability, Tories must win across the free world, reassert the nation state, end appeasement. Almost the permission for that was given to you by the Brexit vote. Yeah. So it's completing that journey.
That's what I believe. That's what I believe the Brexit vote was about, and that's what I believe people want. And what I've learnt in my time in Number 10 and before is we simply don't have the... I called in my CPAC speech, I talked about a bigger bazooka. Yeah. We didn't have a big enough bazooka, and that's what now needs to be built to actually deal with these issues.
Yeah. One of the lines was quite striking from the book. Why am I the only Tory in the room, you thought, looking around the group gathered for when the late Queen died. That's an extraordinary thing to say, isn't it? That almost fuels the idea there's an elite running the world, and you're the challenger trying to take it on.
Well, that's what it felt like.
Yeah.
It felt like at every single meeting that we had, whether it was foreign ministers or leaders, you've got Joe Biden in the White House, Trudeau, Macron, Olaf Scholz. And these people have not made the West stronger.
But they're elected.
They've made the West
But they're
weaker.
elected democratically, of course. I mean, they have a...
I know. Well, I want a Democrat. I want a democratic change.
Yes.
In those nations. I want to see conservative leadership across the world, because I think, what have we seen with leftist leadership? We've seen the adoption of the net zero agenda, which has undermined our competitiveness. We've seen the adoption of the woke agenda, which has meant, children being mutilated. We've seen the adoption of the human rights agenda, which has meant we can't deport illegal immigrants. So it's not working.
Yep.
It's not working.
Before I wind up, it's been so interesting talking to you, Liz Truss, and this book is well worth the read for anyone who wants to be challenged about their view of how this country is run, I think. Some quick questions about the Tory party. Should Nigel Farage be allowed back in somehow?
Yes.
To neutralise Reform UK? Okay.
Well, I think he should be allowed in, yeah.
Yeah. Boris Johnson, mistake to remove him?
Yes, definitely.
Should he be allowed? But he may want to return.
I think he's a member of the party. I mean,
probably is, isn't
he? That's up to Boris, really, what he does.
I was struck by your description of ministers as child emperors. I mean, that's almost brilliant and slightly dismissive of them as well.
But it's... there's so much...
The tea and coffee and matters and my lunch.
About exactly what the lunch is or how things like that will be arranged and not... if you actually challenge the fundamental orthodoxy, I'd often find in government departments, so the Treasury, I would say X, Y, Z, and they would go, no, that's not Treasury policy. And I say, well, I'm the minister. You're not the minister.
Bloody well
Why
do
is
it.
this not Treasury policy?
Yeah.
And there would be a view that the Treasury took or the Foreign Office took, which was totally independent.
Yeah.
Of which Foreign Secretary or Chancellor was there at the time, and I think that's a problem.
And often
that is not democracy.
And ideas wait on the shelf until the right MPs, ministers come along, then they pull them off the shelf.
Yes, I think the smoking ban had been sitting on the shelf for some time.
Yes.
And being pushed
Why
on
is the
various
Tory government
ministers.
doing that? Why is the Tory government doing that?
Well, what I know is that that proposal was sitting in the Department of Health.
For a while.
And what happens is the officials keep pushing it.
Just wait until it happens. Your book's called 10 Years to Save the West. What is Liz Truss's plan for the next 10 years?
I really don't have a plan.
You have a plan? Well, you written a book about everyone else's plan. What's wrong with your plan?
I don't have a plan beyond the next 10 months. Yeah, I want to stand again in South West Norfolk. I'm seeking re-election. I want to make this argument and explain to people what I have learned.
Get that road built.
About we need to get the road built. We need to get the hospital built. We need to get all these things built. But what I want to do is expose what is going on. Because I think a lot of people are frustrated. They say, why aren't politicians able to deliver what they say they will deliver? And my book is, I think, hopefully gives people some kind of insight into how government works or doesn't work. And what do I ultimately want to see? I ultimately want to see a Conservative government elected that is going to deal with the leftist bureaucratic state. Because until we do that, we are not going to we're not going to be able to deliver the Conservative policies that this country deserves.
Do you want to be a leader again?
I'm not aspiring to anything like that.
We're in the pub, no one's listening, Liz.
No one's listening. I'm not aspiring to anything like that.
You're not ruling it out?
The reason I ran for leader in the first place is I want things to change in Britain. I am prepared to play any role in making that change happen. I think my role at the moment is trying to change the debate. Change the debate. And actually, you're an exception, obviously, Chopper, but a lot of these political journalists are focused on such superficial, frivolous issues.
The PM's trainers.
Rather than, exactly. I mean, it's pathetic. Yeah. And we need to get much more serious about what the problems are in this country and how we fix them. Well, Liz Truss, thank you for your time to join me in the pub today. It's been great to have you here. I'd love to know what your thoughts are watching or listening to this podcast and what Liz Truss had to say. I tweet at Christopher Hope on X. Email me, chopper@gbnews.uk. If you've enjoyed it, please tell your friends. If you've really enjoyed it, I know Liz Truss has, please leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. That helps other people find this podcast. Thank you to the brilliant team around this podcast, those behind the camera and recording it, Mick Booker, Jeff Marsh, Rebecca News, George McMillan, Emil Kunda and Paul Nell. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. If you want more Chopper in your life, I know Liz Truss does, and who doesn't, catch me during the week on GB News on midday on Wednesdays for PMQs Live. And keep up to date with the best reporting on our website, gbnews.com. But until next time, cheerio!